95% contained, 95, 71, 55, 55, 44, 25, 23, 13. Those are the containment figures for 9 of the 10 largest wildfires burning in the United States tonight, and every single one of them is a fire being won. The 10th is a fire called the Sinlahekin in Okanogan County, Washington. 102,000 acres, 9 days old, 5% contained, 1,100 firefighters are working it, and $9 million have already been spent, and that number has barely moved. So tonight we're going to work out exactly why it is stuck, why almost nobody outside Washington state has heard its name, and why on Saturday afternoon a fire 50 miles to the south did something that should change how you look at every map you have ever trusted. If you want more of this, hit that like button and subscribe to the Skylab, because we follow these stories the whole way through, not just on the day they make the news. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and whether the air where you are has started turning that colour yet. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The number that won't move. 10 wildfires are burning in the United States tonight at or above roughly 97,000 acres. Line their containment figures up in order, and you get a sequence that looks almost reassuring. 95%, 95%, 71, 55, 55, 44, 25, 23, 13, and then 5. That last number belongs to a fire called the Sinlahekin. It is burning in the Loomis State Forest, north of a town called Connecticut, in Okanogan County, Washington, not far from the Canadian border. As of the afternoon of August 4th, 2026, it had burned 102,934 acres, and 5% of it was contained. It was discovered on July 26th, 9 days. Do that arithmetic with me, because it is the arithmetic that makes this a story rather than a statistic. 102,000 acres divided by 9 days is roughly 11,437 acres per day, every day, for 9 consecutive days. That is a fire adding an area larger than most American cities to itself between one morning and the next, and it has done it 9 times in a row without a meaningful pause. The next least contained fire in that group of 10 is a fire called Tartar, burning in Idaho, sitting at 13%, which means the Sinlahekin is not slightly behind the pack. It is roughly 2.5 times behind the fire that is doing second worst, and here is the part that should genuinely bother you. 2 of the fires ahead of it on that list are bigger. The Crosswhite Fire in Oregon has burned 306,347 acres, and it is 55% contained. The Coleman Creek Fire, also in Oregon, has burned 274,635 acres, and it is at 23%. Both of them were discovered before the Sinlahekin was. Both of them are 3 times its size. Both of them are further along. It is worth putting names to that list because the shape of it matters. The largest fire in the country right now is Big Grass, in Oregon, at 342,352 acres, discovered on July 23rd, and it is 25% contained. Crosswhite, 306,000 acres, 55%. Coleman Creek, 274,000, 23%. Kaiser Canyon in Washington, 136,547 acres, 44%. Tartar in Idaho, 107,856 acres, 13%. Babylon in Utah, 107,000 acres, 95% contained. Second Flat in Oregon, 105,000 acres, 55%. Aspen Acres in Colorado, 101,000 acres, 71%. Cottonwood in Utah, 97,000 acres, 95%. 9 fires. 9 of them are being fought successfully, some of them nearly finished. Babylon and Cottonwood have both been burning since late June, and both of them are now essentially wrapped up. And then there is the 10th one, 9 days old, 100,000 acres, 5%. Notice something about the 2 Utah fires in particular. They were discovered on June 22nd and June 26th. They had been burning for 6 weeks, and they are done. 6 weeks of work produced 95% containment on a 100,000-acre fire. 9 days of work on the Sinlahekin produced 5. So the obvious question is the one you are already asking. What is different about this one? To answer that, I need to hand you something first, because almost everybody watching this has the wrong idea in their head about what that percentage actually means. And once you have the right idea, about 8 other things in this story stop being confusing. Containment is not a measure of how much of a fire has gone out. It is not a measure of how much is left to burn. It is not a countdown. It is not a progress bar. And it does not tell you how dangerous the fire is. Containment is the fraction of the fire's perimeter that has a completed control line around it, which the incident commander believes will hold. That is the whole definition. Line, finished, on the edge, that somebody in charge is willing to bet on. Everything else you have ever assumed about that number is something the number never claimed. And the moment you hold that definition properly, some very strange facts snap into focus. Down in Gilliam County, Oregon, there is a fire called the Hay Creek Complex. It is 98% contained. It has also burned 200,292 acres. 98% contained does not mean 2% burned. It means that after 200,000 acres of destruction, crews have finally drawn a line around almost all of the edge. The containment number and the damage number are describing completely different things, and they always have been. Now hold that thought, because there is a fire near Spokane I am going to come back to later, and the thing it is doing right now is arguably the strangest fact in this entire video. Its forward progression has been stopped. It is not moving, and its containment is 0%. Not low, 0. I will come back to that. But keep it in the back of your mind, because it is the key that unlocks everything. Let me clear up one other thing before we go further, because the internet has already decided what the answer is, and the internet is wrong. This is not a fire that nobody is fighting. The Sinlhekin is being managed by a Type 1 incident management team. In the American wildland fire system, that is the top of the ladder. Type 1 teams are the ones you send when the complexity of an incident has exceeded what a regional organization can absorb, and there are only a limited number of them in the entire country at any one time. Having a Type 1 team assigned is itself a statement that the situation is serious. There are 1,099 personnel assigned to it, 1,100 people, and the estimated suppression cost, as of the data we have, is $9.2 million. 1,100 firefighters on 102,000 acres works out to roughly one person for every 94 acres of burning ground. Picture that for a second. 94 acres is about 70 football fields. One person. Then, next to them, 70 more football fields, and one more person. $9 million has been spent. A Type 1 team is on it. 1,100 people are out there in 100-degree heat, with drip torches and hand tools and dozers, and the number will not move. Which tells you something important, and it is not what the comment section thinks. The problem here is not effort. It is not incompetence, and it is not indifference. 1,100 people are not failing to do their jobs. The problem is arithmetic. And once you see the arithmetic, you will understand why this particular number is stuck, why it might stay stuck, and why the thing everybody is watching is the wrong thing to watch. Part 2. What 5% actually buys you. Containment is a ratio, and ratios have two halves. That is the entire trick, and almost nobody explains it. The top half of the ratio is completed control line. Actual physical line. Ground where the fuel has been removed down to mineral soil by a hand crew or a dozer, or a road or a river or a rock face that crews have decided is defensible, or ground that has been deliberately burned out ahead of the fire so there is nothing left for the fire to take. That is the numerator. That is the work. The bottom half of the ratio is the total perimeter of the fire, the whole outline, every mile of edge wherever it happens to be that morning. Now run those two numbers against a fire that is adding 11,400 acres a day. Every day that fire gets bigger, its perimeter gets longer. The denominator moves. It moves overnight while crews are sleeping, and it moves during the afternoon while crews are cutting. So you can have a situation, and this is exactly the situation the Sinlhekin appears to be in, where a crew builds line all day, gains real ground in absolute terms, adds actual miles of finished defensible edge to the map, and then the fire runs in the evening and the percentage goes down, or stays flat. They did not lose the line. They lost the race between the line and the perimeter. That is what 5% looks like from the inside. It is not a measure of failure. It is a measure of a chase. Let me walk you through how this fire got here. because the timeline is the argument. On July 31st, the Sinla-Hekin was estimated at roughly 30,200 acres. Containment, 0%. On August 2nd, 2 days later, it was 73,794 acres. Containment, still 0%. On the morning of August 3rd at 8 o'clock, it was estimated at approximately 85,000 acres. Containment, 0%. And on August 4th, it was 102,934 acres at 5% contained. Look at what happened between July 31st and August 2nd. 30,000 acres to nearly 74,000 acres. That is a factor of 2.44. The fire more than doubled in about 48 hours. And in the single, most recent reporting period, it added approximately 29,200 acres, not over a week, in one reporting cycle. 29,000 acres is 2.5 times the fire's own average daily rate, which is already an enormous number. Which creates a problem I want you to sit with, because it changes how you should read every wildfire headline you see for the rest of the summer. The acreage figure is stale before it is published. Think about the chain. An infrared flight maps the perimeter, usually at night, when the thermal contrast is best. That map gets processed. It goes to the incident management team. It goes into the morning briefing. It goes into a public update. By the time it reaches your phone, the number describes a fire that stopped existing several hours ago. Every number you have read about this fire, including the ones I have just given you, describes a fire that is already gone, and it is worth understanding exactly where that lag comes from, because it is not laziness and it is not secrecy. It is physics and daylight. Fire perimeters on incidents this size are mapped primarily by infrared. An aircraft flies the fire carrying a thermal sensor, and it flies at night, because that is when the contrast between hot ground and cool surroundings is greatest, and the imagery is cleanest. That flight produces raw data. The raw data goes to an infrared interpreter, who turns a field of thermal returns into an actual polygon, distinguishing active flame front from interior heat, from smouldering ground already burned. That polygon becomes the map that goes into the morning operational briefing. From the briefing it goes to the public information officer, and from there it goes out. Every one of those steps is necessary, and every one of them costs hours. By the time the acreage figure is on your screen, it is describing a perimeter that was flown in darkness, interpreted at dawn, and briefed at 6 in the morning. On a fire that adds 11,000 acres a day, that is not a small gap. Which means that when you read a headline about a fire like this, you are not reading the news. You are reading the archaeology. So what does the 5% actually represent physically out there on the ground? I want to be careful here, because I am reasoning rather than reporting. But there is a well-understood pattern to how line gets built on a fire this size, and it is worth walking through. The first line you build is almost always the easiest line. Crews anchor on things that already exist: a gravel road that runs along a ridge, a river or a creek bottom, a rock scree with nothing in it to burn, a block of ground that burned last year and has not grown enough fuel back to carry fire again. You start where the landscape is already doing half the work, because that is where you can get a crew in safely and get them out safely, which means the first 5% of a fire's perimeter is frequently the 5% the country handed you for free, and the remaining 95% is the ground that offered nobody an anchor, steep, roadless, unbroken fuel running to the horizon. That is not the easy work with a bit more effort. That is a different category of work entirely. There is one more reason to be suspicious of the number, and it is subtle. Containment is an assessment. It is a human judgment, made by an incident commander, about whether a piece of line will hold, and an incident commander who has watched wind conditions like the ones in the forecast for the next several days is not going to declare line contained on optimism. If the wind is expected to test everything you built, you do not call it contained. You call it line, and you wait. Which means the 5% is not just a measurement of how much work has been done. It is also a measurement of how much confidence anybody has in it. There is one further wrinkle, and it explains why containment figures sometimes go down as well as up, which baffles people every single fire season. Line is not permanent. A control line is a physical feature that has to keep being true. If the fire crosses it, or if a spot fire lands outside it and takes hold, or if a section of it is judged no longer defensible under changed conditions, that percentage of the perimeter stops counting. It gets subtracted. So a fire that was at 20% in the morning can be at 12% in the evening, not because anyone made a mistake, but because the fire went somewhere. Containment measures a claim, and the fire is entitled to dispute the claim at any time, which means that on a fire like the Sinlahekin, where the wind is expected to test everything for the next several days, the 5% is not just a floor that will slowly rise. It is a position that has to be held. And to understand where that confidence went, you need to know what this fire is actually burning. Because it is not what most people picture when they hear the words Washington State wildfire. Part 3. The grass problem. Short grass, up to about a foot tall. That is the fuel. That is what 102,000 acres of the Sinlahekin fire is running through. Not old-growth timber, not dense conifer. Grass. And I know how that sounds. It sounds like the least frightening fuel there is. It is the exact opposite, and the reason why is worth understanding properly, because it explains every strange thing this fire has done. Start with what a fire in heavy timber has to do. In a forest, the fire's rate of spread is governed mostly by fuel loading, by moisture content, and above all by energy. Big fuels have mass. Mass has to be preheated before it will ignite. A fire moving into a stand of timber has to dry out and heat up everything in front of it before it can take it, and that costs time and energy. Timber fires build slowly. They also, and this is the important half, stop slowly. All that stored heat keeps working after the wind drops. Now take all of that away. Cured fine grass has almost no mass. It has almost no moisture, because in early August in eastern Washington it has been dead for weeks. It is thin, it is dry, and it is continuous, which means there are no gaps for the fire to have to jump. There is essentially nothing to preheat. The fire does not have to work its way into the fuel. The fuel is already ready. The physical consequence is this, and it is the single most useful thing to know about the Sinlahekin. In grass, the rate of spread tracks the mid-flame wind speed almost linearly. Read that again. The fire is a function of the wind, not roughly, not loosely, close to directly. Double the wind and you are in a fundamentally different fire, and this has consequences that cascade all the way through the operation. The first consequence is that there is no warning window. On a timber fire, there is a lag between conditions changing and fire behavior changing, and that lag is where firefighting happens. It is when you reposition, when you commit resources, when you decide where to make a stand. On a grass fire, that lag collapses to almost nothing. There is no meaningful gap between the wind picking up and the fire running. You cannot preposition against fire behavior that is downstream of a variable that changes hourly. The second consequence is about the line itself. A control line has a width. It is a gap in the fuel, and it works because a flame front cannot reach across it. But how wide that gap needs to be depends on the wind, because the wind determines how far the flames lean forward and how far the embers get thrown. A line that holds perfectly in a 10-mile-an-hour wind can fail in a 30-mile-an-hour wind. Same line, same crew, same ground, different day. And here is where this stops being an abstract physics lesson. 30 to 35 miles an hour is exactly what the fire weather products are forecasting across the interior west for the next 48 hours. I will come back to those numbers in detail later, and they are worse than you are expecting. But hold on to this. The line that is holding today was built for today's wind. The third consequence resolves something that sounds like a contradiction, and is not. You can read that this fire added 29,000 acres in a reporting period, and then read the next morning that fire activity has moderated. Both statements can be completely true at the same time, because grass gives no inertia in either direction. When the wind comes up, the fire runs immediately. When the wind lays down, the fire stops almost immediately, because there is nothing left burning that has enough stored energy to keep pushing. A grass fire is not a machine that spins up and spins down. It is a switch. So when an incident update tells you fire activity has moderated, it is not spin and it is not comfort. It is a description of the wind right now, this morning. It says nothing whatsoever about this afternoon. There is a technical term for what makes grass behave this way, and it is worth having because it is the cleanest single idea in fire science. Fuels are classified by how quickly their moisture content responds to the air around them. Grass, pine needles, small twigs, anything under about 1/4 of an inch thick are called 1-hour fuels. That name is literal. If the humidity drops, a 1-hour fuel comes into equilibrium with the new conditions in roughly 1 hour. A log on the forest floor is a 1,000-hour fuel. It takes about 6 weeks of changed conditions to meaningfully change how wet that log is. So consider what that means on a day when the humidity falls into single digits by early afternoon, which is exactly what the forecast has been describing across the interior west this week. The heavy fuels do not care. They're running on a 6-week average. The grass has already responded completely within about 60 minutes, which is why a grass fire can be quiet at 10 in the morning and be the biggest fire in the country by 6 in the evening. The fuel woke up over lunch, and it also explains the overnight problem, which is the half of this that firefighters actually lose sleep over. On most fires, the night shift is the good shift. Temperatures drop, humidity climbs back up, the fuels take on moisture, and fire behaviour moderates enough for crews to get line built in front of it. That overnight humidity recovery is the most valuable resource in wildland firefighting, and it does not appear on any budget line. Take it away by holding overnight temperatures high, and the night shift stops being an opportunity and becomes just a darker version of the day shift. In a 1-hour fuel, that swing happens fast enough to matter within a single operational period. There is one more number here that I want to hand you, because it looks like good news and is not. $9.2 million spread across 102,934 acres works out to roughly $89 per acre. That is a cheap fire. In wildland fire economics, $89 an acre is nothing. Fires in the wildland-urban interface, the places where houses and forest meet, routinely cost hundreds or thousands of dollars per acre because what you're buying is not ground. You're buying structure protection. You're buying engines parked in driveways, sprinkler systems on rooftops, crews assigned to individual neighborhoods. The Sinlahekin cost $89 an acre because there is not much out there to defend per acre, which is the story of this fire in a single figure. It is enormous, it is uncontrolled, and it is cheap, and all three of those facts have the same cause. So we have a fire whose speed is set by something nobody controls and everybody forecasts, burning through a fuel that gives no warning, in country where the economics of suppression have quietly decided it is not worth very much. The question that follows is the one that actually matters to the people living there. Where is it going, and who is standing in front of it? Part 4. Everything west of the Okanogan River. The fire is moving toward Palmer Mountain, Rattlesnake Peak, South Pine Creek, and the ground west of the Okanogan River. Those are just names if you have never been there. So let me read you something else instead, and I want you to hear it as a map rather than a list because that is what it is. Level 3 evacuation. Tonasket, Ellisford, North and South Pine Creek, the Lime Belt, Palmer Mountain, everything west of the Okanogan River to Aeneas Mountain, everything west of the river. Washington State uses a 3-level evacuation system, and it is worth knowing what the levels mean because the language is deliberately plain. Level 1 is, be ready, get your documents together, know your route, be aware. Level 2 is be set, be packed, be in the vehicle or beside it, expect to leave with very little warning. Level 3 is go now. Level 3 is not advice. Level 3 means that the agency issuing it has concluded there may not be time for a second notification. And underneath that evacuation notice is a detail that reframes the whole scale of this, and almost nobody has reported it. The power is out from Tonasket north to the Canadian border. Sit with what that means in that country, because it is not the same as a power cut in a city. Most rural properties in the Okanogan draw their water from a well. A well needs a pump needs electricity. When the power goes down, the well goes down, and when the well goes down, so does the pressure in your taps, your hose, your sprinkler, and whatever you are planning to use to wet down your roof. The power failed during a wildfire, and the domestic water supply went with it. Those are not two problems. That is one problem with two symptoms. There is a geographic logic to that evacuation boundary as well, and it tells you what the incident commander is thinking. When an order says everything west of the river is being used as the thing the fire is expected to reach. You do not draw an evacuation line at a feature you're confident about. You draw it at a feature you are hoping about. The Okanogan River runs roughly north to south through that part of the county, and Tonasket sits on it. Highway 97 runs alongside. So the fire is coming east off the high ground, off Palmer Mountain and Rattlesnake Peak, and down through the Pine Creek drainages, and everything between it and the river has been told to leave. A drainage, incidentally, is exactly the wrong shape to have a fire in. Cold air pools in them at night and pushes downhill, which drags fire with it in directions that surprise people. During the day they act like chimneys, and fire in a chimney does not spread, it accelerates. The names on that evacuation list, North Pine Creek, South Pine Creek, are not just places. They are terrain features that make fire behave badly. The Loomis State Forest, where this started, is state trust land. Mixed grass and timber rolling into the mountains, running up toward the border. It is beautiful country, and it is empty country, and until 9 days ago, most Americans had never heard of it. The ignition was lightning. That is worth saying clearly because every large fire in America now arrives with an accompanying theory. There is no arson here, no negligence, no downed line, no discarded cigarette, no conspiracy. A dry thunderstorm passed over the Loomis State Forest on July 26th and put fire into a fuel bed that was already cured, and 9 days later, a piece of Washington state the size of a small county is burned. That phrase, already cured, is doing a lot of work, so let me give you the number underneath it. As of the week of July 28th, 47.89% of the contiguous United States was in drought. Not abnormally dry, in drought, which is a specific category. 28.3% was in severe drought or worse. 10% was in extreme drought or worse, nearly half the country. And the number improved slightly that week, by less than a percentage point, which tells you how far it has to come back. I want to be honest about what that does and does not explain, because this is where science reporting usually gets sloppy in both directions. You cannot attribute this fire or any individual fire to drought conditions or to any large-scale climate state. That is not how attribution works, and anybody who tells you otherwise is selling something. What you can say, and what is not controversial at all, is this. A fuel bed in that condition is a different fuel bed. It cures earlier in the season. It cures more completely. And it turns an ordinary summer lightning outbreak, the kind that happens every year and mostly produces a scattering of small fires that go out on their own, into something else entirely. There is a second number worth putting beside it. 67.92% of the contiguous United States was at least abnormally dry that week. That is the wider category, the one that includes ground that has not crossed into formal drought, but is running below where it should be. 2/3 of the country. And sitting underneath all of it is a shift in the Pacific that almost nobody outside the field has noticed. The Oceanic Niño Index, which is the standard measurement of whether the tropical Pacific is in an El Niño or a La Niña state, has done something unusual over the last 5 overlapping seasons. In the November to January season of 2025, it stood at negative 0.54, which is La Niña territory. By the March to May season, it was positive 0.51, and for April to June of 2026, it came in at positive 0.98 and still warming. That is a swing of 1.52 degrees Celsius in the space of about half a year from one side of the system to the other. The underlying sea surface temperature in that patch of the Pacific went from just under 26 degrees to nearly 29. Again, that does not light a fire in the Loomis State Forest. Nothing about that number tells you anything about Okanogan County on July 26th. But it is the weather system that shapes a summer, and when a country that is already 48% in drought gets a summer shaped that way, the fuel bed you end up with in August is not the fuel bed the maps were drawn for. The lightning was normal, the fuel was not. And you can watch the same mechanism play out 300 miles south, which we will get to, where a single storm system in the middle of July is still burning in the first week of August. So here is where we stand. There are 1,100 firefighters, $9.2 million, and a Type 1 incident management team committed to a fire that is now larger than some American cities, in a fuel that responds instantly to wind, during a week when the forecast is nothing but wind, with an evacuation order covering everything on one side of a river and the power out to an international border. And unless you live in Washington state, there is a very good chance that until you clicked on this video, you had never heard the word Sinlahekin in your life. That is not an accident. It is not a cover-up either, which is what a certain corner of the internet has already decided. The real explanation is stranger than a cover-up and considerably harder to fix. Why has nobody seen this fire? Part 5. 40,000 people, larger than Connecticut. Okanogan County, Washington, has a population of roughly 40 to 42,000 people. The county covers a land area larger than the entire state of Connecticut. I want to let those two sentences sit next to each other for a second, because everything that is strange about the visibility of this fire falls out of them. Connecticut has 3.5 million people in it. Okanogan County has 40,000, spread across more ground. It is one of the emptiest large counties in the lower 48 states, a place of long valleys and orchards and cattle ground, and enormous distances between anything and anything else. Now put that next to Spokane. The city of Spokane holds approximately 230,000 people, and it holds them in one contiguous urban area, the second largest in Washington state. So here is the chain, and I want to walk it link by link because it is the actual answer to why you have never heard of this fire, and it is not the answer most people reach for. National coverage requires footage. That is not a criticism, it is just how the medium works. A story that cannot be shown is a story that competes badly against stories that can. Footage requires cameras, not just news cameras, phone cameras, doorbell cameras, dash cameras. The overwhelming majority of the wildfire imagery that reaches you was not shot by a journalist. It was shot by somebody who lives there and pointed a phone out of a window. Cameras require people. Every camera has a person behind it, and people are exactly what Okanogan County does not have. That is it. That is the whole mechanism. There is no editorial meeting where somebody decided the Sinlahekin was not worth covering. There does not need to be. In a county with one person for every several hundred acres, a fire can burn 100,000 acres and generate almost no images because there was nobody standing anywhere near it holding a phone. The fire is not being hidden. It is being unphotographed. And the effect on the outside world is identical. It helps to picture what that emptiness actually looks like on the ground, because Americans who have never been east of the Cascades tend to imagine Washington state as Seattle, with trees around it. Okanogan County is not that. It is orchard country in the valley bottoms, apples and cherries along the river where there is irrigation, and then it climbs. Above the orchards it is rangeland and open grass and scattered pine, and above that it runs up into the mountains and eventually into Canada. The distances between things are measured in tens of miles, and the roads that connect them are frequently the only road that connects them, which matters enormously for an evacuation incidentally. In a suburb, when a neighbourhood is told to leave, there are half a dozen ways out. In a valley with one highway running along one river, there is one way out, and it runs parallel to the fire. Now think about what that does to the people actually inside it. Somebody in the Connecticut Level 3 zone has been told to leave their home immediately. Their power has been out, possibly for days. Their well pump does not work, so they have no running water. They may have livestock they could not move. They are exactly as evacuated as anybody in Spokane, in exactly the same danger, facing exactly the same loss. And almost nobody outside their own county knows their fire has a name. The consequences of that are not only emotional. Visibility does real work in a disaster. Donations track coverage. Volunteer surges track coverage. Political attention tracks coverage, and political attention is upstream of how quickly certain kinds of assistance move. None of that is a conspiracy either. It is just what happens when a system for allocating sympathy and money runs on images, and one place has no images. And once you start looking for this pattern, you find it everywhere in that part of the state. There is a fire burning in the Pasaitan Wilderness, north of the Methau Valley, at 14,447 acres, 0% contained. It has essentially no public profile whatsoever. There is a fire called Braden Hill, southwest of Colville, at 4,300 acres and 7% contained, and there is a fire called Moderate, burning in Ferry and Stevens counties near Inchelium, west of Lake Roosevelt, at 50,000 acres and 17% contained. 50,000 acres. That is a fire that in most years, in most places, would be the story of the summer. Ask somebody in Seattle to name it. Ask somebody in Spokane to name it. There is also a resourcing dimension to the emptiness, and it is uncomfortable. Mutual aid in the American fire system flows toward need, but need has to be communicated, and communication runs through people. A metropolitan fire district that loses neighborhoods has a public information officer, a mayor, a congressional delegation, and 30,000 phone videos making the case for it in real time. A rural county has a fire marshal and a sheriff, both of whom are currently extremely busy. None of that is anyone behaving badly. It is that the machinery for converting a disaster into a response has an input, and the input is attention. And there is a version of this that goes further than undercoverage, which is under measurement. A fire in country with nobody in it does not just generate fewer news reports. It generates fewer reports of every kind. Fewer 911 calls describing where the smoke is. Fewer people phoning the incident line to say the fire has crossed the county road above their place. Fewer eyes on the fire at the exact hours when the mapping aircraft is not overhead. Incident management teams are extremely good at their jobs and they are not blind. But a considerable amount of what any fire organization knows about a fire in the first days comes from ordinary people telling them things. When there is nobody to tell them anything, the picture assembles more slowly. So the emptiness that keeps the fire off television also, in a smaller and more practical way, keeps it slightly harder to see from inside the system that is fighting it. Which raises a question that goes well beyond one county in Washington. If coverage volume does not track fire size, and it plainly does not, then what exactly is it tracking, and what have we all been using it as a substitute for? Part 6. Coverage follows. The footage. Let me take the conspiracy version of this seriously, because it is already circulating, and because it is closer to right than most of them get. The claim goes like this. The Sinlahekin is the least contained megafire in the country. It has burned an area the size of a small city. It has forced level 3 evacuations across a whole side of a river, and the national press has essentially not covered it. Therefore somebody is choosing not to cover it. The first half of that is entirely correct. The disproportion is real. It is measurable. You can put the acreage of the Sinlahekin next to the volume of coverage it has received, and next to the same two figures for other fires, and the mismatch is not subtle. So if you have been frustrated about this, your instinct was picking up something real. It genuinely is being undercovered relative to its size. The second half is where it comes apart, and the reason is more interesting than the accusation. For a media conspiracy to produce this outcome, somebody would have to make a decision. There would have to be a moment where a fire was covered and then uncovered, a story pulled, an instruction given. And you do not need any of that. The absence of imagery produces this result automatically, with nobody making any decision at all, which is, in a way, worse. A decision can be reversed, a structural feature cannot. Back on July 26th, in our video on the firefighting system itself running out of people, we looked at what happens when the National Wildland Fire Response gets stretched past what it was built to carry. This is the same season, further along, and it is what came afterward. That video was about the people fighting the fires running out. This one is about what the fires did once they had won, and the proof of the mechanism is sitting right there in the same state, in the form of a perfect counterexample. The Spokane complex is 8,026 acres. 8,000. It generated national coverage within roughly a day, and it deserved every bit of it, for reasons I am about to go through in detail, because what happened in those neighborhoods is the worst thing in this entire story. But look at the two numbers together. 8,026 acres. 102,934 acres. That is a ratio of about 12.5 to 1, and the attention runs in exactly the opposite direction. Here is the thing I want to be fair about, though. Neither of those rankings is wrong for its own purpose. Coverage is optimizing for reach and for consequence to people, and the Spokane complex destroyed hundreds of homes in a metropolitan area. Of course that leads. It should lead. Fire danger is optimizing for fuel, wind and terrain, and those three things have never once cared how many people are watching. The problem is not that either system is broken. The problem is that the public uses the first one as a proxy for the second one. If it is on the news, it is serious, and if it is not on the news, it must be under control. That substitution is invisible, it is almost universal, and this week it is wrong. We have always believed that the biggest disaster gets the loudest coverage. But what if the relationship runs the other way, and the coverage is simply a map of where the population is wearing a disaster's clothing? Because if that is true, then the fires you have heard of over your whole life are not a sample of the fires that happened. They are a sample of the fires that happen near people with cameras. Every impression you have about where fire is a problem in this country, which states which years, which decades were bad, has been assembled from that filtered set. That is not a small thing. It shapes where money goes. It shapes which landscapes people believe are at risk. It shapes what the average person thinks a wildfire even looks like, which is a house burning, because a house burning is what gets filmed. Meanwhile, the ground itself, the 100,000 acres of grass and range and state forest, burns essentially in private, and notice that it is the exact same failure as the containment number. Somebody sees 5% and thinks, mostly not dealt with, but only 5% burned. Somebody sees no coverage and thinks, must be fine. Two completely different indicators, two completely different mechanisms, and they both fail in the same direction on the same fire on the same day. There is a way to test whether the mechanism I have described is the real one, and it involves a fire I have mentioned only in passing so far. Kaiser Canyon is burning in Washington state. It has burned 136,547 acres, which makes it larger than the Sinlahekin. It was discovered on July 16th. It is 44% contained, which is to say it is being fought successfully. Now ask yourself when you last saw a headline about Kaiser Canyon, if the explanation for the Sinlahekin's invisibility was something like political embarrassment, or agencies suppressing a failure, or the press deciding a story was inconvenient, then Kaiser Canyon should be the opposite case. It is a success. 44% on a fire that size is genuinely good work in these conditions. There is nothing to hide and every reason to publicize it, and it is just as invisible, which tells you the sorting mechanism has nothing to do with whether a fire is going well or badly. It has to do with whether there is anybody standing near it. Kaiser Canyon is doing fine and nobody is covering it. The Sinlahekin is doing terribly and nobody is covering it. The variable that both of them share is not their containment figure, it is their population density. That is a much less satisfying answer than a conspiracy, and it is considerably harder to do anything about, which is usually how you can tell an explanation is the real one. Which brings us to the fire that got all the cameras, because what happened there matters enormously, and it also contains the single clearest demonstration of everything I have been telling you about what these numbers actually mean. Part 7. 3 fires that became one. Old Trails, Autumn Lane, Fairview. Those are the 3 fires that burned into the edges of Spokane, and as of the most recent reporting, they are no longer being managed as 3 fires. They have been consolidated into a single incident, the Spokane Complex. Complexing fires is a specific operational move, and it is worth understanding because it tells you something about how bad a situation has become. When 2 or more fires are close enough that they share a perimeter, or share the roads you would use to reach them, or are competing for the same aircraft and the same crews, running them as separate incidents becomes actively harmful. You end up with 2 incident commanders bidding against each other for the same helicopter. You end up with 2 operational maps that disagree about the same ridge. So command merges them. 1 set of objectives, 1 resource order, 1 map, 1 person deciding what matters most this afternoon. There is a whole vocabulary underneath this that is worth having, because it lets you read incident reports the way the people writing them intend. American wildland fires are classified by complexity, from Type 5 at the bottom, which is a couple of people and a few hours, up to Type 1 at the top. The type is not about acreage. It is about how much organization the incident requires, how many agencies are involved, how many aircraft, how many jurisdictions, how much is at risk, how long it is expected to run. A Type 3 incident might have 30 people and an operations chief. A Type 1 incident has a full command structure with sections for operations, planning, logistics and finance, hundreds or thousands of personnel, a dedicated air operations branch, and a team that arrives as a unit and takes over from local command entirely. So when you read that the Sinlahekin has a Type 1 team on it, that is not a detail. That is the system saying this exceeded what the region could handle, and there are only so many of those teams in the country. Everyone that is committed to a fire in Okanogan County is a team not available for the next one. The individual sizes tell you why the complex was necessary. Old Trails at 3,620 acres, Autumn Lane at 3,347, Fairview at approximately 1,100, together 8,026 acres, containment across all 3, 0%. And now I can finally close the loop I opened at the start of this video, because the Fairview fire is doing the thing that makes no sense until you have the definition right. The Fairview fire's forward progression has been stopped. It is not running. It is not advancing. The fire is functionally sitting still, and its containment is 0%. Walk through that slowly with me, because this is the most useful thing in this entire video, and it applies to every fire you will ever read about. Forward progression stopped is a fire behavior statement. It describes what the fire is doing. It means the head of the fire is no longer moving into new fuel, usually because the wind dropped, or the fire ran into a change in fuel or terrain, or crews got in front of it and stopped the run. Containment is a control line statement. It describes what the crews have finished. It means a completed defensible line around a measured fraction of the edge that somebody is willing to certify will hold. They are two different measurements of two different things made by two different processes. There is no contradiction in a fire being motionless and uncontained. It just means the fire has stopped moving and nobody has yet built and certified the line that would let them put a number on it. A fire can sit at 0% doing absolutely nothing for several days. And the inverse is just as true and considerably more dangerous. A fire at 50% containment can make the biggest run of its life at 3 o'clock that afternoon, because the 50% is behind it. The wind is in front of it. Containment tells you about the ground you have already fought over, not the ground you are about to. There is a reason this distinction is so persistently misread, and it is not the public's fault. Almost every other percentage anybody encounters in daily life is a progress bar. A download at 50% is halfway done. A charge at 90% is nearly full. A survey at 70% complete has 30% to go. Containment is the only major number in disaster reporting that looks exactly like a progress bar and is not one. It is a spatial measurement of a boundary, presented in a format the human brain has been trained by everything else in its environment to read as time remaining. So when somebody hears 5% contained and feels a small flicker of relief, that is not stupidity. That is a reasonable person applying the rule that works for every other percentage they will encounter today. The scale of the response around Spokane matched the scale of what was happening. Governor Ferguson declared a statewide wildfire emergency and imposed a statewide burn ban on Saturday. Spokane County declared its own state of emergency on top of that. There are now states of emergency in both Washington and Oregon simultaneously. A statewide burn ban is worth a moment, because people frequently misread what it accomplishes. It does not do anything about the fires already burning. What it does is remove the human ignition tail. Debris burning, campfires, agricultural burning, equipment use, all the ordinary summer activities that in a normal August produce a background rate of new starts. In conditions like these, one new start in the wrong drainage is a week of somebody's life. It also, notably, does nothing whatsoever about lightning, which is what started all three of the fires at the centre of this story. Then there are the evacuations, and this is where the numbers stop being abstract. Approximately 65,000 people were evacuated in the Spokane area. 65,000 out of a city of roughly 230,000. Something in the region of a quarter of the population of Washington's second largest city was told to leave, and one detail inside that number is harder than all the rest of it. A Veterans Affairs Medical Center was evacuated. Evacuating a hospital is the most difficult category of evacuation that exists, because the people inside it are, by definition, the people least able to evacuate themselves. Every patient has to be moved with their care, their equipment, their oxygen, their records, and their destination arranged in advance. It is an operation that takes hours under ideal conditions and is done, in this case, with fire on the edge of the city. And it has a second-order effect that rarely gets discussed. When a medical facility evacuates during a disaster, the region loses that facility's capacity at the exact moment demand for it spikes. Every patient moved out occupies a bed somewhere else. Every ambulance running a transfer is an ambulance not available for a call. A hospital evacuation during a wildfire is not just a logistics problem for the hospital. It is a subtraction from the emergency medical capacity of an entire city on the day that city needs the most of it. 65,000 people is also a number worth sitting inside for a moment, because it is easy to hear it as an abstraction. 65,000 people leaving is somewhere on the order of 25,000 vehicles, moving mostly at the same time, mostly in the same direction, on roads that were designed for a normal Sunday. It is people leaving with pets and without pets. It is people who had a plan and people who did not. It is people who could not find their documents and left without them, and people who went back for one more thing, which is the single most dangerous decision available in a fire evacuation and one that people make constantly. And every one of those departures happened at level 3, go now, which is issued precisely when the agency has decided there may not be time for a second notification. So put the two fires side by side one more time. The Spokane complex, 8,000 acres, 0% contained. The Sinlahekin, 102,000 acres, 5% contained. By containment, the Sinlahekin is doing better. I do not think anybody would argue that the Sinlahekin is the fire in better shape, which means the number is not ranking the danger, and it never was. And the worst number in Spokane is not the containment figure or the acreage, or even the evacuation count. It is a number that everybody involved already knows is wrong. Part 8. 650, and the count isn't finished. Approximately 700 structures have been destroyed across the Spokane complex. That figure by itself is difficult enough, but the way it distributes across the 3 fires is the part that should stop you. Roughly 640 of those 700 came from the Old Trails fire alone. 1 fire out of 3 accounts for something like 91% of all the structures lost. There is a reason for that, and it is not that Old Trails was the biggest. It was not by much. Old Trails is 3,600 acres against Autumn Lane's 3,300, which is close to a rounding difference at this scale. What happened is that Old Trails ran through the interface, and the others largely ran through ground. The wildland-urban interface is the technical name for the zone where development meets undeveloped vegetation. It is not the same as a city, and it is not the same as forest. It is the place in between, and in the American West it is where almost all of the structure loss happens. A fire that spends its whole life in open range can burn 100,000 acres and take out a barn. A fire that runs 3,000 acres through the interface can take 640 homes, which produces a ratio worth putting on the record. 700 structures across 8,026 acres works out to roughly 1 structure destroyed for every 11.5 acres burned. Now set that against the Sinlahekin, 102,934 acres. If the Sinlahekin were burning at the Spokane complex's rate of structure loss, it would have destroyed nearly 9,000 buildings. Obviously it has not, because it is burning through grass and range and state forest rather than through neighborhoods. But the comparison makes the point cleanly. Acreage and loss are measuring different things, in the same way containment and danger are measuring different things, and none of these numbers can be substituted for any of the others. It is worth understanding why the interface behaves so differently, because it is not simply that there are more things to burn. It is that the things burning are different in kind. In open range, a fire has one way of moving. The flame front advances through continuous fuel, and if you break the fuel, you break the advance. In a neighborhood, the fire acquires a second mode entirely. Once one structure is fully involved, it becomes an ignition source in its own right, radiating enough heat to ignite the house next door and throwing embers into gutters and attic vents and wood piles further down the street. At that point, the vegetation stops being the thing that carries the fire. The buildings do, which is why interface fires can keep spreading after the wildland fire behind them has been stopped, and why a fire that has burned 3,000 acres can take 640 homes. It stopped being a wildfire somewhere in the second block and became an urban conflagration with a wildfire's ignition source. It also explains the resourcing decision that produces the cost figures. On an interface fire, engines get assigned to individual streets, sometimes individual houses. Structure protection is enormously labour-intensive, which is why the dollars per acre go up by an order of magnitude, and it is also why crews assigned to defending homes are, by definition, crews not building line. And the 700 figure has a specific quality that makes it stranger than the others. Everybody involved already agrees that it is wrong. Damage assessment teams are still working. They are moving neighbourhood by neighbourhood, and they have not finished. It is worth knowing how that count is actually produced because it is not an estimate from an aircraft and it is not a model. Damage assessment is done on the ground, parcel by parcel. Teams walk into a burned area once it is safe enough to enter, they go address by address, and they classify each structure by a defined standard. Destroyed, major damage, minor damage, affected, or no damage. It is slow, deliberate, and deeply unpleasant work, done by people walking through the remains of somebody's house with a clipboard and a camera. And because it is done that way, an unfinished assessment always undercounts. There is no mechanism by which walking more parcels finds fewer destroyed buildings. The number can only go one direction, so when the revised figure comes out, and it will come out within days, it will be higher. Nobody knows by how much. There is one more thing that the structure count hides, and it deserves saying out loud. A structure count does not distinguish between a primary residence, a rental, a barn, a workshop, a garage, or a shed. 700 structures is not 700 households. It is some smaller number of households, plus everything else those households owned that stood on its own foundation, which means the human figure underneath, the number of families who are now living somewhere else, is a different number entirely, and it takes considerably longer to produce. Meanwhile, 65,000 people have been displaced into shelters and spare rooms and hotel car parks across a city that is itself sitting under smoke from the same fires. There is no clean air side of Spokane to evacuate to. The air quality alerts across eastern Washington are in effect until further notice for Asotin, Chelan, Douglas, Ferry, Okanogan and Stevens counties, which is to say for essentially the entire eastern half of the state. Those 4 words at the end of that sentence deserve more attention than they get, until further notice. Most weather products have an expiry time on them. A severe thunderstorm warning runs for 45 minutes. A red flag warning runs until 7 in the evening. Air quality alerts issued during a fire siege frequently do not, because nobody knows when the fires will stop producing smoke and nobody is willing to guess. An alert with no end time is an agency telling you, as politely as it can, that it does not know how long this will last. And smoke is the part of a fire emergency that reaches the most people and generates the fewest headlines, because nobody evacuates for air. There is no dramatic footage of somebody's lungs. The health effects arrive as a background hum across an entire population, rather than as a photograph of a burning house, and they land hardest on exactly the people who are least visible in every other part of this story. People with asthma and heart conditions, outdoor workers who cannot simply stay inside, older people in houses without filtration, and small children whose airways are still developing. There is one more layer to it that is specific to this week. Nationally, on August 4th, there were 217 active National Weather Service alert products. 42 of them were air quality alerts. That was the second largest category of weather alert in the entire United States, behind only marine advisories. Not heat, not flooding, not severe storms. Air quality, which is one of those numbers that quietly tells you what kind of summer this actually is. So here is where we are, the most precisely counted number in this whole story. The one produced by human beings walking individual addresses with a checklist, is the one number that everybody agrees is currently wrong and is going to rise. And every other number we have looked at, containment, acreage, coverage volume, is either measuring something other than what people think it measures, or is stale before it reaches them. Which leaves one obvious question hanging over the entire state. If the fire everybody is watching is the one at 8,000 acres, and the fire nobody is watching is at 100,000 and climbing, then what is going to stop either of them? Because 50 miles to the west, on one of the busiest lakes in Washington, a third fire had just finished proving that the thing everybody assumed would stop it does not. Part 9. Little Giant. On July 15, 2026, lightning struck in the mountains north of Lake Wenatchee and started a fire that nobody had any particular reason to worry about. It was burning in the Entiat River country and the Chihuahua, out toward the edge of the Glacier Peak Wilderness. That is genuinely remote ground. Designated wilderness on one side, national forest on the other, steep, roadless, and about as far from anybody's house as it is possible to get in western Washington. The initial commitment was 35 firefighters. 35. On a fire in wilderness country in the middle of July, that is a reasonable, proportionate response. You send a crew, you scout it, you see what it does. For 2 weeks, what it did was burn quietly in country nobody was in. That quiet period is worth understanding, because it is not neglect, and it is not a mistake. Fire in designated wilderness occupies a genuinely different policy space from fire anywhere else. Wilderness is legally managed to keep natural processes running, and fire is one of those processes. A lightning start in wilderness, with nothing at risk and no likelihood of leaving the boundary, is frequently monitored rather than attacked, because putting it out would be actively contrary to the management objective for that ground, and because attacking it means putting crews into terrain where a helicopter cannot land, and an injury becomes a multi-hour extraction. So a fire like the Little Giant gets watched. Somebody maps it, somebody flies it, Somebody makes a daily assessment of whether the conditions that made it safe to watch are still true. And those assessments are correct right up until the moment they are not, because they are all built on a forecast, and forecasts have horizons. A fire that has been behaving predictably for 14 days accumulates a kind of institutional calm around it. It becomes the fire nobody has to talk about in the morning briefing, and that calm is exactly the state a fire is in on the day before it does something nobody planned for. Then on Saturday, August 1st, it was estimated at 31,528 acres, 0% contained. By the following days it had pushed past 38,500, then past 51,000, then to 59,346. Every one of those measurements carries the same containment figure, 0. But the number that actually tells you what happened is not the acreage, it is the staffing, 35 firefighters to approximately 1,349 in a matter of days. That is not an increase. That is a category change. A resource order that goes from 35 people to over 1,300 is an incident management system announcing that everything it believed about this fire on Friday is no longer operative. You do not move that many people that fast for a fire that is behaving the way you expected. You do it when the fire has done something that rewrote the forecast. And there is one more detail about the little giant that deserves attention before we get to what it did on Saturday, because it is a small observation with a large implication. The little giant is burning on the same flank that burned in the previous fire season. That is unusual, and it is worth understanding why. In heavy timber, a stand replacing fire is supposed to buy you time. It consumes the fuel. The ground is left with ash, and standing dead, and not much that will carry a flame front. Depending on the forest type, you might get years, sometimes decades, before that slope will burn well again. This is one of the oldest and most reliable assumptions in fire management. Burned ground is a fire break. In grass, and especially in the invasive annual grasses that have spread through the interior west over the last century, that assumption falls apart. An annual grass does not need decades. It needs a spring. It germinates, it grows, it cures, and by August it is a foot of dry fuel standing exactly where last year's fire went through. A slope can recure and recarry fire inside a single growing season. And there is a nastier version of this that the literature describes clearly for cheatgrass systems in the Great Basin. Fire does not just fail to protect that ground. It actively favours the invasive over the native perennials it displaces, because the invasive is adapted to recolonise burned ground quickly, and the natives are not. So each fire makes the next fire more likely, and each one shifts the plant community further toward the fuel that burns fastest. That is a positive feedback loop, fire making fire easier. I want to be careful here, because I am describing a documented mechanism, not diagnosing this particular slope above Lake Chelan. Nobody has published a fuel survey of that flank, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What I can say is that a slope that burned last season, and is carrying fire again this season, is behaving the way the invasive annual model predicts, and not the way the timber model predicts. Take that as a hypothesis worth watching rather than a conclusion. There is a broader version of this worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes how you should think about the map of the American West. For roughly a century, the working assumption in fire management has been that landscapes accumulate. Fuel builds up over years, fire eventually removes it, and the removal buys time. Under that model, the fire history of a place is a kind of ledger, and a recent burn is a credit. In a system dominated by invasive annual grasses, that ledger stops balancing. The fuel does not accumulate over decades, it regenerates over months, which means the credit expires almost immediately. Ground that burned last August is not protected ground this August. In some cases it is worse than it was, because the fire cleared out the slower growing natives that were competing with the grass, and this matters for planning in a way that goes well beyond one slope above a lake. If you are building a strategy around burned ground as a barrier, deciding where to anchor a line, deciding which flank is safe to leave, deciding where a fire will run out of fuel, the model you are using needs to know which kind of system you are standing in. Old assumptions do not fail loudly. They fail on one particular afternoon, on one particular flank, when a fire goes somewhere the map said it could not, because on Saturday the wind came up and the little giant reached the water. Part 10. The mile of water that didn't stop it. Lake Chelan is about 50 miles long. It is one of the deepest lakes in the United States, a glacial trench running back into the Cascades, and it is over a mile wide in places. In the first week of August, it is also one of the busiest places in Washington state, full of boats and campgrounds and rental houses and people who have been coming to the same stretch of shoreline every summer for 30 years. On Saturday, August 1st, driven by high winds, the Little Giant Fire came down to the shore of that lake, and an ember was carried more than 2 miles north and east across open water. It landed on the far shore, and it started a new fire. I want to give that a moment, because it is the single most important physical fact in this entire video, and it is not being covered anywhere near as widely as it should be. The lake is more than a mile wide at its widest points. The ember travelled more than twice that distance, over water, and arrived still hot enough to ignite fuel on the other side. Let me walk through how that actually works, because the mechanism is genuinely remarkable, and most people have never had it explained. It starts with the convection column. A large fire generates an enormous amount of heat, and that heat drives a column of rising air above the flame front. In a big run, that column can be thousands of feet tall, and it is moving upward with real force. Anything light enough gets carried up in it. Burning bark, pieces of grass, fragments of branch, cones. These are called firebrands, and they go up inside the column like ash over a bonfire, except at a scale where the bonfire is a mile wide. At altitude, the brand exits the column and enters the ambient wind field, and now it is a small burning object, high up, in wind that is moving considerably faster than the wind at ground level, with nothing to slow it down and nothing to put it out. It travels downwind while it falls, still burning. Whether it starts a fire when it lands depends on whether it is still burning on arrival, and whether it lands on something receptive. 4 variables set the distance. The size and density of the firebrand, because too small and it burns out in flight, too large and it does not stay aloft. The height of the plume, because that sets how long it has to fall. The wind speed at the altitude it is travelling, which is what carries it. And atmospheric stability, which determines how high the column can build before it flattens out. On Saturday afternoon above Lake Chelan, all 4 of those lined up. It is worth knowing which materials actually make good firebrands, because it is not intuitive. The best long-distance spotters tend to be pieces of bark, particularly the fibrous, stringy bark that sheds off certain trees in sheets. Bark has a useful combination of properties. It is light enough to loft, it has a large surface area relative to its mass so it catches the wind, and critically, it smoulders rather than flaming. A piece of material that burns with a flame consumes itself fast. A piece that glows can stay alight for a very long time while it travels. Cones do it too. So do fragments of rotten wood, which are porous and hold combustion the way charcoal does, and there is a nasty property that some brands have, which is that they break up in flight. A single large ember can fragment on the way, and each fragment is now a smaller, lighter brand with its own trajectory. One departure from the fire becomes a shower of arrivals downwind spread across an area rather than landing in a point, which means the far shore of a lake does not get one ember, it gets a distribution. And once a brand lands, what happens next is a separate lottery. Most embers land on something that will not take, and go out. The ones that matter land on fine, dry, receptive fuel, and specifically on the kind of fuel that will accept a smouldering ignition, rather than requiring a flame. Cured grass, pine needles cast into a corner. Duff. A brand that would bounce harmlessly off green vegetation in June will find a receptive bed almost anywhere in that country in August. Which is the same fuel condition problem from the beginning of this video, arriving now as a completely different kind of threat. Here is what makes this specific case scientifically clean, and it is the reason I think this event matters well beyond Washington state. Long-range spotting is not new. It is well documented and well studied, and fire behavior analysts model it as a matter of routine. But in almost every recorded case, there is ambiguity. A spot fire found half a mile ahead of the main fire could be a firebrand, or it could be the main fire having crept through a fuel connection. Nobody noticed, through a draw or a fence line or a strip of unburned brush. Over water, that ambiguity does not exist. There is no fuel connection across a mile of lake. Nothing crept. There is no mechanism by which fire moves across open water except through the air, which means this event is a clean measurement, more than 2 miles, unambiguously, through the atmosphere, and something on the far end was still alight when it arrived. There is one additional idea I want to offer here, and I am flagging it clearly as reasoning rather than something anyone has measured on this fire. A water surface is aerodynamically smooth. Forest canopy and broken terrain are not. Rough surfaces generate drag and turbulence in the layer of air just above them, which slows the wind near the ground and mixes it. A smooth surface does less of that. So, it is at least physically plausible that a firebrand crossing open water encounters a faster, less disturbed wind field than the same brand would meet crossing the same distance over ridges and trees. If that is right, then a large lake is not merely a poor firebreak under extreme conditions. It might, in some circumstances, be a better transport medium than the ground. I want to be honest that I have not seen that quantified for this event, and I am not going to state it as a finding. But it is the kind of question this Saturday afternoon just put on the table, and here is why any of this matters beyond the physics. The assumption that water stops fire is not just something the public believes, it is baked into how we plan. Evacuation zone boundaries follow shorelines and rivers because those are natural, defensible, easily communicated lines. Defensible space guidance treats a body of water as one of the best possible neighbours a property can have. And ordinary human intuition, the thing that actually determines what people do at 4 in the afternoon when they can see smoke, says the same thing. We are on the other side of the lake. We are fine. On Saturday afternoon, at a specific hour on a specific lake, that stopped being true. And I want to be precise about what did and did not just get disproved, because there is a version of this that overstates it, and a version that undersells it, and both are wrong. A lake is still a total barrier to a flame front. Nothing about Saturday changes that. Fire cannot creep across water, cannot run across it, cannot climb through it. If the only mechanism a fire had was the flame front, a mile of water would end the conversation permanently. What Saturday demonstrated is that under certain conditions, the flame front is not the fire's only mechanism. The fire also has an air campaign, and the air campaign does not care what is on the ground underneath it, which reframes the entire idea of a firebreak. A firebreak is not a wall. It is a gap in the fuel, and a gap in the fuel defeats one of the 2 ways fire travels. Against the second way, its effectiveness is a function of width against wind, and that means every firebreak in the world has a wind speed above which it stops working. A road works until the wind is strong enough to throw embers across it. A river works until the wind is strong enough to throw embers across it. And now we have a measurement for a large lake under strong wind, and the measurement is that more than a mile was not enough. Which raises a question that ought to make anybody who lives in fire country uncomfortable. If a mile of open water can be crossed, what is on your own mental map as the thing that will stop it? The highway at the end of your road, the river at the bottom of the valley, the green fields on the far side. Every one of those is a firebreak with a wind speed written on it in invisible ink, and almost nobody knows what the number is. The people who plan evacuations do think about this. Fire behaviour modelling includes spotting distance, and any competent analyst on a fire in that country is running numbers on it. But the boundaries that get drawn on a public map, and the ones that get drawn in a person's head as they decide whether to go, are simpler than the models, and they are simpler in the same direction. They assume that a big enough obstacle is an obstacle, and then crews went to put the spot fires out. Part 11. 30 acres on the wrong shore. A fire behaviour analyst assessed the combined spot fires across the water at more than 30 acres. That job title is worth explaining because it carries the credibility in this part of the story. A fire behaviour analyst is a specialist position inside an incident management team, and their entire function is prediction. They take the fuel model, the terrain, the observed fire behaviour, and the forecast, and they tell the operations chief what the fire is going to do this afternoon and tonight. When a fire behaviour analyst puts a number on something, that is not a reporter's estimate. That is the person inside the organisation whose job is to be right about exactly this. More than 30 acres, on the far shore, from embers. Crews went after them. They travelled by boat north of Safety Harbour Campground, which is the only way to get to much of that shoreline, and they could not safely access the fires. Not because of the fire, because of the terrain. Steep, rugged ground, dropping straight into the water, with no route in that a crew could take and expect to get back out of. Sit with the shape of that for a second. A fire that started because an ember crossed a lake, burning on ground that nobody can stand on, reached by boat, and left burning because there was no safe way to engage it. That is the modern fire problem in a single image. Not a lack of will, not a lack of people, with 1,300 of them now assigned. Geography. The evacuation architecture that came out of Sunday reads like a map of retreat, and I want to read it to you the way it was written, because the precision of it tells you how carefully somebody was thinking. Level 3, go now on South Lake Shore Road from Pyramid Creek to 25 Mile Creek. Level 2, be set from Fields Point to 25 Mile Creek State Park, including Shady Pass and Robinson Lane and the state park itself. Level 1, be ready from Fields Point to State Route 971. 3 nested zones, stepping down from go now to be ready as you move away from the water, and inside those zones, every campground. In the first week of August, on a destination lake at peak occupancy, which introduces a category of problem that most fire plans handle badly. A campground population is transient. It is largely unregistered in any system that emergency management can query, and a substantial fraction of it consists of people who have never been in that county before, do not know the road network, may not have cell service, and have no idea what Level 3 means. Evacuating residents is difficult. Evacuating tourists is a different discipline entirely, and a lake evacuation has a particular problem that a road evacuation does not. A meaningful fraction of the people in those zones are on the water. Boats do not receive reverse 911 calls. Somebody anchored in a cove on a Sunday afternoon with the radio off has no mechanism by which the evacuation order reaches them at all, and the way they will find out is by looking up. There is also the question of what happens to the boats themselves. In a shoreline evacuation, vessels are property that has to be moved, and moving them means going toward the water rather than away from it, at the exact moment everybody's being told to leave. That is a conflict that fire agencies have very little ability to manage, and that people will resolve on their own, in the direction you would expect. And there is one more line in that notice that changes the scale of the whole thing. Notices are now posted on both shores, the South Shore and the Manson side. Manson sits on the north shore of the lake, and it is not empty country. It is orchards and houses and vineyards and a lot of structures, and structure exposure there is significant and growing, which means the fire is no longer a fire on one side of a lake with a lake in front of it. It is a fire on both sides of a lake, in a valley where the wind funnels along the water in the first week of August. And the geometry of that valley is its own problem. Lake Chelan sits in a glacial trench with steep ground rising off both shores, and a long narrow body of water between mountains does a specific thing to wind. It channels it. Air that would spread out and slow down over open country gets squeezed into the corridor and accelerates along the axis of the lake, which means the wind that carried an ember 2 miles across the water was not necessarily a 2-mile wind out in the flats. It may have been a valley doing what valleys do. Structure protection along a shoreline like that is also unusually difficult. On a normal interface fire, you get engines to houses by road, and the road network gives you options. Approach from one side, escape to the other. On South Lakeshore Road there is one road. It runs along the water with steep ground above it, and the fire is on the steep ground. An engine parked in a driveway on that road has water on one side and burning slope on the other, and exactly one direction to leave in. That is the kind of situation where incident commanders start pulling crews out of areas rather than putting them in, not because the houses do not matter, but because there is no version of defending them that has an acceptable escape route. Those decisions are made quietly, they are almost never explained publicly, and they are the reason some neighbourhoods burn with nobody standing in them. There is an unresolved piece here too, and it is the part of this story I would most like an update on. Nobody has reported what happened to those 30 acres. Crews could not reach them on Saturday. Whether they went out on their own, whether they grew, whether they merged with anything on the Manson side, is simply not in the record as of the data we have. Now come back to the number, because the little giant has been carrying the same containment figure since the day it started. 0%. It was 0% when it was 35 firefighters and nobody was worried. It was 0% at 31,000 acres. It is 0% at 59,000 acres with 1,300 people on it, and spot fires across a lake that nobody can reach. That number did not change when the situation changed because that number was never measuring the situation. For 2 weeks, 0% on a fire in empty country read like nothing. It was never nothing. It was unmeasured. Which leaves 2 fires in one state, both effectively uncontained, both growing, and one forecast covering both of them. Part 12. 4 rankings, 4 answers. Let me put the 3 fires side by side one final time, because the comparison is the argument and I want it in one place. The Sinlahekin, 102,934 acres, 5% contained, the largest fire in Washington state by a wide margin, and by a wide margin the least controlled fire in the country. The Spokane complex, 8,026 acres, 0% contained, around 700 structures destroyed, 65,000 people evacuated, a hospital emptied. The Little Giant, approaching 60,000 acres, 0% contained, currently throwing fire across a lake nobody thought it could cross. Now rank them by containment percentage, and the Sinlahekin comes out on top. It has the best number of the 3. Rank them by structures destroyed, and the Spokane complex is in a category of its own, by a factor of hundreds. Rank them by acreage, and it is the Sinlahekin again, but for the opposite reason. Rank them by how much coverage they received, and the Spokane complex is first, the Little Giant is a distant second because it happens somewhere people go on holiday, and the Sinlahekin, the biggest and least contained of the 3, is last. 4 rankings, 4 completely different answers, and the general public is handed the first one, the containment figure, as though it were a summary of the other 3. It is not a summary of anything. It is a measurement of Finnish control line, which is a genuinely useful thing for a firefighter to know, and an almost useless thing for a member of the public to use as a threat assessment. And then there is the thing that ignores every one of those 4 rankings entirely, which is the smoke. Air quality alerts are in effect until further notice across Asotin, Chelan, Douglas, Ferry, Okanogan, and Stevens counties. That is not a zone around a fire. That is most of a state. Smoke does not read the evacuation map. It does not care which side of the river you are on, or whether your county has cameras in it, or what percentage of any perimeter has line around it. It goes where the wind takes it, and the wind this week is taking it in 2 directions at once, which we will get to. Nobody evacuates for air, and air is what reaches the most people. Think about the asymmetry in that for a second. The evacuation zones in this story cover, at the very outside, a few 100,000 people across 2 states. The smoke from the same fires is currently sitting over millions, and by the end of this week it will have touched a substantial fraction of the western United States. The people inside the evacuation zones will appear in every number that gets published. The structure counts, the displacement figures, the assistance applications, the eventual retrospectives, they are correctly the priority. The people under the smoke will appear in none of them. There is no register of who breathed it. The health effects show up months later as a slight elevation in respiratory admissions across a whole region in a study nobody outside the field will read, which is the same pattern one more time in its final form. The thing that is measured gets attention, the thing that gets attention gets resources, and the largest effect of this entire fire siege is a thing that is barely measured at all. Here is the fact that shows how badly the coverage mechanism is broken, and I have been holding it back for this moment. Kaiser Canyon has burned 136,547 acres in Washington state. That is more than the Sinlahekin. It is 44% contained, which means it is going comparatively well. It is also almost completely uncovered. So it is not that Washington's big fires are ignored. It is not that failures are ignored, or that successes are ignored. Kaiser Canyon is doing well and nobody is looking. The Sinlahekin is doing badly and nobody is looking. What both of them share is not their containment number, their acreage, or their trajectory. It is that there is nobody standing near them. There is a 4th Washington fire I have barely mentioned, and it belongs here because it completes the pattern. The Modrite fire is burning in Ferry and Stevens counties near Inchelium, west of Lake Roosevelt. 50,000 acres, 17% contained. 50,000 acres. In most summers, in most states, that is the fire of the year. Here it is the 4th or 5th item on a list, and I would guess that a majority of people watching this, including people who live in Washington, have never heard its name. And the Pasiten fire north of the Methau, at 14,000 acres and 0%, will get less attention than any of them, for a reason that is worth naming explicitly, because it is a policy choice rather than an accident. It is burning in designated wilderness. There are no structures, there are no roads, and in a system that allocates scarce crews and scarce aircraft according to what is at risk. A fire threatening nothing gets fought last. That rule is rational. It is also, taken across a whole season, a machine for producing exactly this outcome. The remote fires grow while the visible ones get resourced, and then in September everybody asks how the remote ones got so large. And now widen out, because this stopped being a Washington story several days ago. There are simultaneous states of emergency in Washington and Oregon. There are 3 separate Washington incidents sitting at 0% containment at the same time. There is a Type 1 team committed in Okanogan County, 1,300 people committed at Lake Chelan, and a full complex organization running in Spokane. That is an enormous amount of the American wildland fire system, concentrated in one corner of one region in the first week of August, with the historically most dangerous weeks of the season still ahead of it. Step back one more level, and the pattern gets larger than a fire season. At the scale of a single fire, the story is a control line losing a race against a perimeter. At the scale of a county, it is 40,000 people spread across an area larger than Connecticut, with an emergency nobody outside can see. At the scale of 2 states, it is simultaneous emergency declarations and a wildland fire system, with an enormous fraction of its capacity committed in one corner of the map in the first week of the worst month. And at the scale of the fuel itself, it is a landscape that has been changing for a century. Grass replacing shrub, invasive annuals replacing perennials, fire return intervals shortening from decades to years in some systems, because each fire selects for the plant that recovers fastest, and the plant that recovers fastest is the one that burns best. That is a slow process, it is well documented, and it does not make headlines, because it moves at the speed of a growing season rather than the speed of a news cycle, which means a fire like the Sinla-Hecken is not only an event, it is also a readout. It is telling you what the fuel bed in that part of the country has become, in a way that no survey and no report ever quite manages to communicate, because 100,000 acres in 9 days is a sentence anybody can understand, and every one of those fires is now waiting on the same variable. It is not containment, it is not acreage, it is not coverage, it is the wind, and the forecast for the next 3 days is the worst thing in this entire story. Part 13. The rest of a state on fire. Let me put the whole Washington picture in one place, because I have been handing it to you in pieces, and the total is worse than any of the parts. The Sinla-Hecken, 102,934 acres, 5% contained. Kaiser Canyon, 136,547 acres, 44% contained. The Little Giant approaching 60,000 acres, 0% contained. Modrite, 50,000 acres, 17% contained. The Pasayten Wilderness Fire, 14,447 acres, 0% contained. The Spokane Complex, 8,026 acres, 0% contained, 700 structures gone. Braden Hill, 4,300 acres, 7% contained. Add those up and you're looking at something in the region of 375,000 acres of active fire in a single state, with 3 separate incidents sitting at absolute zero on containment at the same time, 3 incidents at 0%, simultaneously, in one state. That is not a normal August, and anybody in the Washington fire community will tell you so. I want to spend a moment on Modrite in particular, because its location carries weight that the acreage figure does not. It is burning in Ferry and Stevens counties near Inchelium, west of Lake Roosevelt. That is Colville Reservation country. Fires on tribal land are a category of loss that the standard reporting apparatus is genuinely not built to measure. A structure count catches houses. It does not catch a cemetery. It does not catch a building that has stood in a community since the 1800s. It does not catch an archaeological site, or a stand of plants that a family has gathered from for 4 generations, or ground that has meaning that does not appear in any assessor's database. When those things burn, the number that gets published afterward is acres, and acres does not begin to describe what happened. I mentioned earlier that the Pasayten fire will get less attention than any of the others, and I want to explain the mechanism properly, because it is not indifference, and it is not a failure. It is a rule, and the rule is defensible. Wildland fire resources in the United States are allocated according to values at risk. That is the actual term of art. When a geographic area coordination center is deciding which of 15 competing incidents gets the one available hotshot crew, it weighs what each fire is threatening. Homes, infrastructure, municipal watersheds, power transmission, life safety. A fire in designated wilderness threatening none of those scores at the bottom of that list every time by design. It is not that anybody thinks wilderness does not matter. It is that when you have one crew and 15 fires, sending them to the fire threatening a town is the correct decision, and there is no serious argument against it. But run that rule across an entire season, with a resource pool that is stretched, and it produces a predictable outcome. The fires threatening things get fought. The fires threatening nothing get watched. And by September, somebody writes an article asking how the remote fires got so big. They got so big because we decided correctly, one fire at a time, to fight the other ones. Now I want to bring back something we tracked back in July, in our video on the heat dome over the southwest, because that structure is not a separate story from this one. It is the same story from above. When we covered that ridge, the question we asked was how long it could hold. The answer, several weeks later, is that it is still there, and the extended forecast has it doing something worse than persisting. It is expanding. North and east, across the Intermountain West and into the high plains, before a trough finally arrives from the northwest early next week and begins to break it down. The numbers underneath it are the kind that make city dwellers think about air conditioning and make fire crews think about something else entirely. Highs of 110 to 120 degrees across the Mojave, and overnight lows of 80 to 95. That second number is the one that matters to a fire, and almost nobody outside the profession pays attention to it. Here is why. Relative humidity is a function of temperature. As air cools overnight, the same amount of water vapor represents a higher relative humidity, and the fine fuels, the 1-hour fuels we talked about earlier, pull moisture back out of that air. By dawn, the grass that was ready to burn at 4 in the afternoon has taken on enough moisture to be difficult to ignite. That overnight humidity recovery is the single most valuable thing a night shift gets, and it appears on no budget line anywhere. It is when crews get in front of a fire. It is when line gets built. It is when a fire that ran all afternoon lies down enough for people to work in front of it safely. Now hold overnight temperatures at 80 to 95 degrees, and that recovery does not happen. The humidity never climbs. The fuels never take the moisture back, and the night shift stops being an opportunity and becomes a darker, slightly slower version of the day shift. The Denver Forecast Office put it in plain language on August 4th, describing a stretch of record-breaking heat poised to continue, with temperatures warming each day through the weekend and some locations on the plains reaching triple digits as early as Friday. Record-breaking heat, poised to continue. That is a forecaster's phrasing for a situation that is not going to give anybody a break. There is a compounding effect in that ridge that deserves one more sentence, because it is not only about the fires already burning. High pressure of that strength suppresses convection over the area it sits on and then intensifies it around the edges, which means the storms get pushed to the margins of the ridge, and the margins move as the ridge expands. New country gets a lightning outbreak, and it gets it at the moment the ridge has finished drying that country out. That is the mechanism that turned mid-July into 2 million acres in Oregon. It is not a coincidence that a lightning episode arrived when the fuels were ready. The same structure that cured the fuels also determined where the storms went. So that is Washington, and that is the air sitting on top of it. And Oregon, 300 miles to the south, is having a worse season than Washington is. It is also getting less national coverage. Part 14, 67,000 acres. From the record. As of the morning of August 3rd, 2026, the state of Oregon had 60 large fires burning and had lost 2,014,481 acres this season. 2 million acres in one state. By the 3rd of August, Oregon's all-time single-season record is 2,081,661 acres. That record was set in 2024. The gap between where the state is now and its worst season ever is 67,180 acres. I want to put that number in a context you already have, because we have been working with a very good yardstick for the last hour. The Sinlahekin fire in Washington is adding roughly 11,400 acres a day. At that rate, 67,000 acres is about 6 days. Now that is not a forecast, and Oregon's fires are not the Sinlahekin. But it tells you the scale of the margin. The distance between the current season and the worst in recorded state history is not a comfortable buffer. It is a week of the kind of growth that is happening right now, one state to the north, and here is the part that should genuinely land. This is the first week of August. Oregon fire seasons do not end in August. Historically, the most active weeks are still ahead, running through the back half of August and into September, and in bad years well into October. The state is within 6 days of its all-time record, with the worst of the season still in front of it. 2024 to 2026 is 2 years, a record set 2 years ago, challenged now, with weeks to spare. That is not a statistical curiosity, and I want to be careful about the claim I am making here, because it is easy to overstate. One record being approached does not prove anything on its own. Records get approached, but a 100-year record broken in 2024 and matched in 2026 is a statement about frequency, and frequency is the thing that determines whether a place is livable. Let me give you the scale a different way, because 2 million acres does not mean much to most people as an abstraction. It is roughly a quarter the size of Vancouver Island. One state, one season, not finished. More than 25,000 people are under some form of evacuation order in Oregon. The individual fires are worth naming, because they show the same patterns we have been tracking all the way through. The Roe Creek complex is burning southwest of Fossil, in Wheeler County, at approximately 320,000. 834 acres and 53% contained. And note the word complex again, because it got there the same way Spokane did, except more so. Roe Creek is 4 separate fires that physically merged into one. 4 fires that grew into each other. That is the fire equivalent of watching separate weather systems combine, and it is what happens when a landscape is uniformly ready to burn. Individual starts stop being individual. The Roe Creek complex is burning roughly 1 mile from John Day Fossil Beds National Monument. 1 mile. The Hay Creek complex in Gilliam County was formerly the Lower Rock Creek and Hogue fires, and it too merged. It stands at approximately 200,000, 292 acres, and it is 98% contained. I flagged that fire at the very beginning of this video, and I want to come back to it now that you have everything else, because it is the cleanest possible demonstration of the central point. 98% contained. 200,000 acres destroyed. That fire is, by the metric everybody uses, one of the great success stories of the season. It is almost completely lined. Crews did excellent work, and 200,000 acres of Oregon is gone. If containment percentage were a measure of how much damage a fire had done, 98% would be an extraordinary result. It is not a measure of that. It never was. 98% means the edge is drawn. It says nothing whatsoever about what is inside the line. There's also the Bench Fire southwest of Warm Springs, at approximately 68,000 acres and 52% contained, threatening the Warm Springs Reservation, Alkali Butte in Deschutes, and Jefferson counties, roughly 28,000 acres, 85%. The Henry Fire, around 30,000 acres, 75%. And now the detail that connects all of Oregon back to everything we have been talking about. Most of those fires were started by lightning between July 15th and July 18th, 2026, one storm system, 4 days, 3 weeks ago. That single lightning outbreak is responsible for a substantial share of 2 million acres, and it's still burning in the first week of August. The Little Giant, 400 miles north, was started on July 15th by lightning as well, which brings the whole argument back around. The lightning was not unusual. Lightning outbreaks in mid-July are what mid-July does in the interior west. Every year, a few days of dry storms move through and put fire on the ground in dozens of places, and in most years most of those fires do very little. What was unusual was what they landed in, and when they landed in it, they stopped being weather and started being a season. And that is the difference between a fire year and a fire season, which is a distinction the people who do this work make constantly, and the rest of us almost never hear. A fire year is a set of events. A fire season is a condition. In a fire year, you get some large fires and you fight them one at a time and the system absorbs it. In a fire season, the whole landscape is available simultaneously, and every ignition becomes a candidate for 100,000 acres, and the system stops being able to choose which ones to fight because it is already fighting all of them. Oregon is not having a fire year. Neither is Washington, and the ledger of the last 3 weeks tells you which one this is. 60 large fires in one state from one storm, 3 simultaneous 0% incidents in another, and a national resource pool with a very large fraction of its top-tier capacity, committed to a single corner of a single region, which is the condition that determines what happens next, because a system in that state has no reserve, and the only thing standing between it and the next 100,000 acres is the weather, and the weather this week is not on anybody's side. Part 15. The wind decides the day. There are 13 red flag warnings active across the United States right now, plus one new fire weather watch. A red flag warning is issued when the combination of wind, low humidity, and dry fuels reaches the point where fire behavior is expected to be extreme. It is not a forecast of fire. It is a forecast of what fire will do if it happens, and it is issued by forecasters who are aware every time that the products they write get read by people deciding whether to send crews somewhere. Let me read you what those 13 products actually say, because the specifics are worse than the headline. The Denver Forecast Office did something unusual. It issued 2 separate red flag warnings in a single product, one running until 7 o'clock this evening, a second running from noon to 7 the following day, 2 stacked days. That is a forecaster saying that today is dangerous, and tomorrow is also dangerous, and there is no meaningful recovery in between. The Denver numbers: west winds 10 to 15 miles an hour with gusts to 30 and 35, relative humidity 7 to 17%, and the official impact statement in the product itself: conditions will be favorable for rapid fire spread. Grand Junction, covering the Colorado River headwaters, the Gunnison Basin, the White River, and southwest Colorado. Gusts to 35. Humidity 8 to 13%. Their impact line is even more direct. Any fire that develops will catch and spread quickly. Salt Lake City, covering the western Uinta Basin at 9 to 12% humidity, and the San Rafael Swell at 5 to 10%. 5%. I want to stop on that number, because it is easy to let it slide past as just another statistic. 5% relative humidity is desert air at the extreme end, in fuels with a 1-hour response time, which is the graphs we have been talking about since the beginning of this video. The air does not take a day to have an effect. It takes about an hour. Fine fuel moisture in those conditions drops to a level where essentially any ignition source works, and where fire behavior goes from predictable to something crews describe with words like plume-dominated. The Salt Lake City product states it plainly. Critical fire weather conditions are expected. Any new fire starts or existing fires may spread rapidly. Medford in southern Oregon has 2 overlapping red flag periods, and one of them explicitly names 2 existing fires in its affected area. Northwest winds 10 to 15 with gusts to 25 in the afternoons, becoming east to northeast overnight. That last clause matters enormously in that country. A wind shift from northwest to east or northeast at night is offshore flow, and offshore flow in southwest Oregon is dry. It is downslope, and it comes at the hours when crews are counting on conditions to moderate. It is the single most feared overnight setup in that part of the world. Portland, on the western Columbia River Gorge, wrote its warning in capital letters, which forecasters do when they want a product to be impossible to skim past. Critical fire weather conditions expected in the western Columbia River Gorge for dry conditions and easterly winds up to 38 miles an hour. 38 miles an hour through a gorge, which is a natural wind tunnel cut through a mountain range. And then there is the Montana product, which I have been saving, because it contains one line that is arguably the most important sentence in the entire forecast package. The Glasgow Forecast Office issued a new fire weather watch for Thursday afternoon and evening, covering 6 fire weather zones: the Fort Peck Reservation and Daniels, Roosevelt and Sheridan counties, Dawson, Macomb, Prairie, Richland and Wibbo, Northern Valley and Northern Phillips, the Little Rockies, the Lower Missouri River. The conditions: northwest winds 15 to 25 miles an hour, gusting to 35, humidity as low as 10%. And then this, in the structured field where a forecaster describes expected convection: thunderstorms. None. 2 words. Let me tell you why they are the 2 most consequential words in that entire product. Thunderstorms during a fire weather event cut both ways. They bring dry lightning which starts fires, and everyone treats that as the danger. But they also bring the possibility of rain, and rain is the only thing in the natural world that reliably ends a fire siege. A forecast that says no thunderstorms is telling you that the ignition risk from lightning is off the table, which is good, and it is telling you, in the same breath, that there is no possibility of wetting rain. None. It is pure dry wind, for a full afternoon and evening, across 6 zones of eastern Montana with humidity in the low teens. That is a forecast with no upside in it. Now put all of that back against the mechanism from the beginning of this video. Fine grass fuel with a rate of spread that tracks wind speed almost linearly. A fuel with a 1-hour response time sitting under air at 5 to 17% humidity. Control lines built for the wind that was blowing on the day they were built, and a forecast promising wind across the entire interior west for 3 consecutive days. So when you read that fire activity as moderated today, and you will read exactly that, in an update from one of these incidents tomorrow morning, understand what it is telling you. It is a statement about the wind, right now, this morning. It is not a trend. It is the space between 2 wind events. There is one more thing I want to say about these products, because it is easy to read a forecast discussion as a machine talking, and it is not. Those warnings are written by human beings, at desks, in offices in Denver and Grand Junction and Glasgow and Medford, who know exactly who reads them. They know that an incident commander is going to make a resourcing decision off that language. They know that somebody in a level 2 zone is going to decide whether to load the car. And they write with a discipline that shows in the phrasing. They do not say a fire will happen, because they cannot know that. They say what conditions will be, and then they say what fire will do in those conditions. Any fire that develops will catch and spread quickly. Conditions will be favourable for rapid fire spread. Any new fire starts, or existing fires may spread rapidly. That is not alarmism. It is the opposite. It is people being extremely careful to say only what they can support, in language stripped of everything except the operational consequence. And when several offices across several states independently write versions of the same sentence on the same day, that agreement is itself information. Read them all together, and the picture across the interior west this week is not 13 separate local warnings. It is one atmospheric setup being described from 13 different desks. And while every one of these fires sat waiting for that wind, the map that most people check when they want to know whether any of this is real was showing almost nothing at all. Part 16. What the satellites weren't seeing. On August 4th, 2026, NASA's active fire product reported 2 hotspots in 24 hours across the entire United States. 0 high-intensity fires flagged. 2. On the same day that 10 separate fires were burning at or above 97,000 acres, I want to take the obvious inference seriously, because unlike most claims that circulate during a disaster, the premise of this one is completely, verifiably true. If you had opened that map on August 4th, you would have seen an essentially empty country, and a reasonable person looking at an empty map and a stack of alarming headlines might conclude that somebody's exaggerating. So let me explain what actually happened, because the explanation is technical, unglamorous, and completely sufficient. That product is a thermal anomaly detector. It works by looking at the ground in infrared from orbit and identifying pixels that are much hotter than their surroundings. It is not a camera looking for smoke or flame. It is an instrument looking for heat, and it is carried on polar orbiting satellites, which means it does not stare. It passes. A given point on the ground is observable only when a satellite happens to be overhead, which for these instruments is a couple of times a day, at roughly fixed local times. So 3 things degrade it, and on August 4th all 3 were operating. Thick smoke attenuates the thermal signal. The infrared radiation from the fire has to get through the smoke plume the fire itself is generating, and a dense plume absorbs and scatters a great deal of it. The bigger the fire, the more smoke it makes, and the more it obscures itself. Cloud blocks it entirely, not reduces. Blocks. If there is cloud over a fire at the moment of the overpass, the instrument sees cloud top. An overpass timing means that if a fire is at its most active, at 5 in the afternoon, and the satellite crosses at 1:30, the detection describes a fire in a state it is no longer in. Add to that the reality that any given feed pool is a filtered subset with confidence thresholds applied, and you can very easily produce a national map with 2 dots on it during one of the worst fire weeks of the year. The detection was incomplete, the fires were not absent, and the independent verification is not subtle. 1,100 personnel assigned to one incident, 1,300 to another, a Type 1 team committed, evacuation orders covering entire river valleys, 700 structures physically destroyed and being counted by people walking parcels, and smoke measured at the surface by ground instruments in 3 states. None of that can be produced by a fire that is not there, and smoke is the last piece of evidence, because it is the one that reached the most people. The Seattle Forecast Office reported on the morning of August 4th that smoke was starting to mix down to the surface, with a heavier smoke expected to arrive that afternoon, potentially reaching as far as the Olympic Peninsula. The Olympic Peninsula, that is the far western edge of Washington state, past Puget Sound, past the Olympic Mountains, about as far from Okanogan County as it is possible to get, and still be in the same state. The mechanism is a ridge amplifying offshore with a thermally induced surface trough forming along the coast, which turns the low-level flow around and pushes air from east to west. Smoke from the fires in eastern Washington gets carried west over the Cascades into the Puget Sound basin, and as the surface heats through the morning, it breaks the shallow inversion holding the smoke aloft, and the smoke comes down to where people are breathing. Back in the middle of July in our video on the smoke crossing the border, we walked through this same mechanism working in the opposite direction, carrying particulates hundreds of miles from fires most of the affected population had never heard of. The physics has not changed, only the direction has, and here is the compound hazard, which is the part of this that genuinely worries me. That same Seattle discussion forecast a 2 to 3 day stretch of widespread moderate heat risk across the interior, with a 20 to 30% chance of major heat risk in South Puget Sound, urban areas on Wednesday and Thursday. So the public guidance on that day says two things at once. For the heat, take frequent breaks indoors, in a cooled building. For the smoke, stay inside, keep windows closed, run filtration. Now consider a household with no air conditioning, which in the Pacific Northwest is an enormous fraction of households, and no air filtration, which is a larger fraction still. On a hot day, the standard advice is to open the windows in the evening and let the cool air in. On a smoke day, that is the single worst thing you can do. Those two pieces of guidance cannot both be followed, and the people who cannot follow both of them are, disproportionately, the same people who are least able to absorb either hazard on its own. And simultaneously at altitude, westerly flow was carrying the same smoke east. The Denver Forecast Office reported patchy smoke across its area for at least another day, with visibility problems for aviation through Wednesday morning. Same source region, opposite directions. Two steering regimes operating on the same smoke at the same time, one at the surface pushing west, one aloft carrying east, and the result is that a fire in a county of 40,000 people is in the air over a substantial fraction of the western United States. So let me land where we started. Containment percentage underread this. It described a fire at 5%, as though 5% meant something about danger, when it only ever meant something about finished line. Coverage volume underread this. It ranked an 8,000-acre fire above a 100,000-acre fire, because one of them had cameras near it and the other did not, and the satellite map underread this. It showed 2 hotspots in a country with 10 megafires, because smoke and cloud and orbital timing conspired on a single afternoon. 3 separate indicators, 3 completely different mechanisms, all of them failing in the same direction, on the same day, on the same story, and none of them were lying. That is the part I want to leave you with. The containment number was accurate, the satellite detection was accurate for what it measured, the coverage was a faithful reflection of where the cameras were. Every one of those instruments answered its question correctly. They were just all answering a different question than the one people were asking. Which leaves one number still moving, and it is the one being produced the slowest, by hand, by people walking through the ruins of somebody's street with a clipboard. The structure count in Spokane stands at roughly 700. Everybody involved says it is going to rise. Damage assessment teams are still working, neighbourhood by neighbourhood, parcel by parcel, and they will not be finished for days. Nobody yet knows what that final number is. And of everything in this story, it is the only figure that will be counted one address at a time.